Dressed in his finest tunic, the Athenian engineer Perilos proudly presented his creation in the inner courtyard of the tyrant Phalaris's palace. The polished bronze shone dazzlingly under the midday Sicilian sun, forcing the courtiers to squint. This was not merely a torture device. It was a brilliant acoustic instrument. A system of pipes and valves inside the hollow bull was designed to transform screams of agony into a melodious lowing, like the roar of a real animal. Phalaris, captivated by the idea, declared that such a perfect creation must be tested immediately. He wanted to personally verify the purity of its sound. On his command, guards seized Perilos himself and forced him inside the red-hot bronze. Thus, the genius who created the most sophisticated machine of pain of his time became its first test subject. His screams, transformed by the mechanism, echoed through the palace like a triumphant roar. This incident is not just a historical anecdote. It is the starting point of our investigation and the key to a central mystery. Why did the most advanced civilizations, the creators of philosophy, law, and art, invest their best intellectual resources into the engineering of unbearable pain? The paradox of the brazen bull was not a singular glitch in the code of civilization. It was the rule. This brings us to our first question. Why was the longest and most excruciating execution in history, scaphism, which could last up to 17 days, invented not by savage nomadic tribes, but by the Persians, the creators of one of the most organized and culturally developed empires of antiquity? The second question is even more unsettling. Why did the Roman Empire, which gave the world the foundations of jurisprudence, spend more resources organizing mass executions in the arena, the so-called damnatio ad bestias, than on the construction of some vital aqueducts? Calculations based on data from the 100-day Games celebrating the opening of the Colosseum show that over 9,000 wild animals were killed in that period alone. This would have been enough to completely decimate the fauna of an entire modern country, such as Lebanon. These are not rhetorical questions. They have concrete, frighteningly logical answers that we will uncover in the course of our investigation. The answers to these two paradoxes will be given in the third and sixth parts of this film. The common perception of ancient executions is that they were a manifestation of savagery, of unbridled and primitive rage. This simplification hides a terrifying truth. By the end of this investigation, you will no longer see chaos in these methods. You will learn to recognize three layers within them. The first, complex engineering systems, where every element was calculated for maximum physical or psychological effect. The second, powerful tools of political propaganda capable of controlling the minds of millions. And the third, most disturbing layer, perverse forms of art, where agony became an object of aesthetic contemplation. We will not simply show you the horrors of the past. Together, we will crack the code of cruelty, a set of principles and mechanisms that allowed civilization to use pain as a technology and a resource. You will see how the echo of this code still resonates in our world today. To ensure you don't get lost in this dark labyrinth, here is a map of our journey. We will stop at 3 key milestones, each revealing a new layer in the mechanisms of cruelty. Here is what awaits you. In 3 minutes, we will open up the brazen bull and, using its acoustic system as an example, understand how engineering turned agony into art. In 11 minutes, we will find ourselves in the stands of the Colosseum, and by analyzing execution by wild beasts, see how death became the greatest political show in history. In 19 minutes, we will reach the climax, the Chinese execution of Lingqi, and understand how a technology was developed not to kill the body, but to erase a person's soul from history. Our journey begins now. First stop, Sicily, 6th century BC, the court of the tyrant Phalaris, where a brilliant engineer is about to present his most lethal creation. How could a scream of unbearable pain become an object of aesthetic pleasure? In the court of the tyrant Phalaris, the Athenian engineer Perilos proposed not just an instrument of execution, he proposed a musical instrument that played on the strings of agony. His design was brilliant in its simplicity, a hollow bronze statue of a bull under which a fire was lit. Inside was a complex system of pipes and resonators that, he claimed, would transform the victim's screams into a melodious and powerful roar. The inventor was trying to please a cruel ruler. However, the reality turned out to be far more twisted. Phalaris ordered Perillos executed not for a crime, but because he wanted to personally test the acoustics. The execution became a monstrous acceptance test of an art object, where the creator's life was the price of a quality demonstration. The successful test confirmed it. The art of cruelty was born. The irony of fate is that 16 years later, the deposed Phalaris was himself burned in the same bull, bringing the circle to a close. The instrument consumed both its creator and its commissioner. And if the bull was the pinnacle of aesthetic cruelty, what can be considered the pinnacle of cruelty stretched over time? Why was the bull made specifically of bronze? Stone would have been cheaper and iron stronger. The choice of this expensive metal was based on cold engineering calculations. Bronze and its alloys, much like in bells, possess unique acoustic properties. At the same time, its high thermal conductivity ensured rapid and even heating, like a cast iron skillet. It was the optimal material from a physics standpoint. But the picture changes when we add politics. The polished bronze, gleaming in the Sicilian sun, shone like pure gold. This turned the death machine into a luxurious monument, visible from afar, a symbol of the absolute power of a tyrant who could afford to grant his enemies a golden death. Diodorus Siculus mentions the most gruesome detail. The bull's head contained a system of tubes designed for incense. The smoke from the burning flesh, mixing with herbs, would exit through the nostrils as fragrant fumes. Horror was transformed into a ritual performance. This engineering could not only embellish death, but also prolong it almost indefinitely. How can we distinguish a grim fairy tale from historical fact? Many modern historians claim the brazen bull is a propagandistic legend invented to tarnish Phalaris's name. So where is the truth? The skeptics' arguments are logical. There are no archaeological findings of the bull itself, and the descriptions come from later authors who may have exaggerated. It seems like just another horror story from antiquity. But the facts refute this convenient theory. First, there is the testimony of the historian Diodorus Siculus, who described the device in detail. Second, archaeologists have found numerous hollow bronze statues in Greece and Sicily from that period, made with the same casting technology. The technological basis for creating the bull existed. The legend was so influential that the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus, after destroying Carthage in 146 BC, mentioned seizing this very statue as a major trophy, which he returned to the inhabitants of Acragas. They believed in its reality. But even the most artistic death pales in comparison to an execution that turned the human body into a multi-day feast. The story of the brazen bull proves that sophisticated cruelty is a product not of barbarism, but of a civilization possessing technology, resources, and imagination. Here, cruelty first became a form of art. While the Greeks used inanimate metal to create an instantaneous theater of death, the engineers of the Persian Empire turned to life itself. They developed a method that harnessed the forces of nature, the biological processes of decay and parasitism, to create an execution that stretched on for weeks. We now move from Greece to Persia to explore an execution whose goal was not the aesthetics of sound, but the maximum prolongation of humiliation and physical decomposition. This is the next step in the evolution of the code of cruelty. From a swift, artistic death by fire and metal, we move to a slow, biological death by honey and insects. How do you make nature itself execute a person for you? Persian engineers of cruelty answered this question by creating scaphism, the first example in history of a biological weapon directed against a single individual. Plutarch called it the boats. Its mechanism was deceptively simple. The victim was placed between two hollowed-out boats, with only their head, hands, and feet left outside. They were then force-fed a mixture of milk and honey until uncontrollable diarrhea began, which would accumulate inside this wooden sarcophagus. But this was only the beginning. The victim's body was also slathered with honey on the outside, turning them into a dual trap. The excrement inside attracted worms, which began to eat the flesh alive from within. The honey on the outside drew wasps and flies, which would sting and lay larvae in the eyes, ears, and nose. The person was turned into a living incubator for their own demise. They were kept fed each day to prevent death from starvation, with the end finally coming from septic shock and gangrene weeks later. It was a sinister form of horticulture. The body was the soil, the milk and honey were the fertilizer, and the executioners merely waited patiently for nature to grow a slow death from it. Who was punished in this way? This execution was not meant for common criminals. Plutarch describes the case of a soldier named Mithridates, sentenced to scaphism by King Artaxerxes II. His crime: he had accidentally killed the king's brother during a hunt and later carelessly boasted about it. At first glance, this seems like a monstrously disproportionate revenge for an insult. But it was not about personal offense, it was about state ideology. In the Zoroastrian culture of Persia, the purity of body and spirit was the highest religious value. Scaphism was designed as an absolute ritual defilement. It turned a human being, the pinnacle of creation, into a rotting, parasite-infested mass of filth. It was a complete symbolic annihilation, a punishment more terrifying than death itself. Mithridates' execution lasted 17 days, more than 400 hours of conscious decomposition. It was a public spectacle that demonstrated that enemies of the empire would not just be killed, but erased from the category of human. The Persians used nature for total humiliation. But the Vikings went even further. They used anatomy to create a ritual symbol. Could this be just a fabrication? Plutarch was Greek, and the Greeks often demonized their Persian enemies. Skeptics point to the absence of any mention of scaphism in Persian sources. This seems like a logical argument, similar to the doubts about the reality of the brazen bull. But three facts suggest otherwise. First, the physiological precision of Plutarch's description points more to an eyewitness account than to fiction. Second, modern reconstructions confirm that such a method would indeed lead to the described consequences. And third, most importantly, this execution fits perfectly within the system of Persian justice, where humiliation and defilement were key elements of punishment. Now we can give a direct answer to the question posed at the beginning. The Persian Empire created scaphism not because it was savage, but precisely because it was a highly developed civilization. It was a systemic, deliberate, and resource-intensive execution that required the daily work of attendants. It was the product of cold, ideological calculation, not primitive rage. Scaphism was the apex of cruelty stretched over time. Its goal was dehumanization. It erased the boundary between a living person and decaying matter, turning biology into the most sophisticated executioner. While the Persians achieved humiliation by distancing themselves from the process and letting nature do the dirty work, in the cold north of Europe, there existed a ritual that demanded the executioner's maximum and surgically precise involvement. It was not a passive observation of decay, but an active creation of a terrifying symbol from a human body. We journey to the world of the Vikings to investigate the blood eagle, a ritual on the borderline between execution, sacrifice, and a brutal anatomy lesson. What lies behind the poetic name, blood eagle? It sounds like a metaphor from a saga, but the Vikings understood it literally. The procedure, described in skaldic texts, was an act of surgical dissection. The skin and flesh were cut from the victim's back, exposing the ribs. Then, one by one, the ribs were severed from the spine with a sharp blade and spread apart like giant wings. The final act was to pull the still-functioning lungs out of the chest cavity and lay them over the victim's shoulders. This procedure required not the fury of a berserker, but the precision of a surgeon. The cuts had to be made exactly along the spine's fibers so the ribs would open rather than break. The highest honor for the victim was to endure this torment in silence, proving their fearlessness. The execution became a final dialogue between two warriors. But was this ritual a reality or merely a figment of the skald's imagination? For decades, historians have debated whether the blood eagle actually existed. Skeptics argue that the descriptions in the sagas are vague and could be mistranslations of Old Norse idioms, or that it was Christian propaganda demonizing pagans. However, recent research is changing the picture. First, the ritual is described in several independent sagas. Second, modern pathologists confirm that the procedure is anatomically possible. In 2021, researchers from Kiel University used computer modeling to prove that the ritual was feasible with the weapons of that era. The blood eagle was likely not a common execution, but a rare, elite ritual. But even if it is a myth, its very popularity speaks to the value Vikings placed on the idea of absolute revenge. The Vikings created a ritual for select enemies, but one civilization put public cruelty into mass production, making it the primary tool for governing an empire. For what crime could a person be sentenced to such a fate? The most famous story is the execution of King Ella of Northumbria. He killed the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok by throwing him into a pit of snakes. In response, Ragnar's sons captured Ella and subjected him to the blood eagle. On the surface, it is simple revenge. But the sagas point to a deeper meaning. It was a ritual sacrifice to Odin, the god of war. The execution ceased to be an act of human justice and became a sacred rite. For the Vikings, such a death was both the most terrible punishment and the highest form of acknowledging an enemy's status. An unworthy opponent would have simply been killed. The blood eagle was an honor reserved for an equal, whose death had to be marked by a great ritual. From rituals for elite enemies, we move to mass executions for all who dared to challenge authority. The blood eagle, whether real or mythical, shows how execution can be intertwined with religion, honor, and ritual. It was an exclusive form of cruelty, full of symbolism understood only within a specific culture. While the Vikings practiced bespoke ritualistic cruelty, the Roman Empire industrialized it. It developed methods that were understood by everyone, from senator to slave, and which became symbols of its limitless power. We will examine two execution systems that Rome perfected, one for the slow, public humiliation of an individual, the other for a bloody mass spectacle to control the mob. Let's start with the one that became the most famous symbol of suffering in world history. Everyone knows about crucifixion, but almost no one understands what victims actually died from. It was not from blood loss from the nailed limbs. The real killer was slow asphyxiation. In a suspended position with arms spread, the victim's chest was locked in a state of exhalation. To take a single breath, one had to push up on the nailed feet and lift the entire body, which caused excruciating pain. It was like trying to surface from underwater with your hands tied. Every breath required a superhuman effort to overcome gravity. Every exhale was a fall back into the abyss of suffocation. Roman executioners were engineers of this pain. They could prolong the agony for up to 3 days by installing a small footrest, the settle. If the execution needed to be expedited, they would simply break the victim's legs, depriving them of support and condemning them to a quick death by suffocation. But why was it so complicated? The Romans did not invent crucifixion. They borrowed it from the Carthaginians and Persians. But it was Rome that transformed this execution into a systematic, legally codified instrument of state policy with one shocking nuance. By law, a Roman citizen could not be crucified under any circumstances. It was a servile supplicium, a slave's punishment, a penalty for those not considered fully human. Cicero called it the cruelest and most disgusting of punishments, unworthy of even being mentioned in polite society. It was not just murder, but a public, legally formalized stripping of human status. Humiliation was just one part of the Roman show. The other required a much grander scale. The largest mass crucifixion in history occurred after the suppression of Spartacus's revolt in 71 BC. 6,000 captured slaves were sentenced to the cross. But they were not executed in one place. The crosses were erected along the entire Appian Way, the main artery of Italy, for 200 kilometers from Capua to Rome. This was not an execution. It was a gigantic installation of terror. A 200-kilometer gallery of death, seen by everyone traveling to the capital, which communicated without words. This is what happens to those who challenge Rome. 6,000 crosses, spaced 35 meters apart, turned the road into a 2-day journey through a corridor of agony. It was the most effective and graphic form of state propaganda, justifying any expense. But if the cross was an advertisement of terror for those traveling to Rome, what was the main show for those already living within it? Crucifixion was the pinnacle of Roman engineering of pain and public humiliation. Its power lay in its slowness, its public nature, and its status as a slave's punishment. It was a static monument to suffering, an eternal reminder of the power of the law. But to manage the seething passions of urban mobs, something different was required. What was needed was not static horror, but a dynamic, thrilling, and bloody spectacle capable of channeling the aggression and ecstasy of the masses. Thus, the arena was born, and with it, damnatio ad bestias, execution by being torn apart by wild beasts. We journey to the Colosseum to understand how death became the greatest political show and the most popular entertainment in human history. Execution by wild beasts seems like a primitive slaughter. Unarmed convicts, hungry predators, a predictable outcome. This is an illusion. The Colosseum was not just a bowl, but a highly complex theatrical machine. Beneath the arena lay the hypogeum, a multi-level labyrinth with dozens of freight elevators and hidden trapdoors. This allowed the show's directors to make lions or bears appear from beneath the ground at any point, turning chaos into orchestrated terror. The hypogeum was the lungs of the Colosseum, inhaling a threat only to exhale it violently upon the spectators. Execution became a perverse art. Myths were reenacted on the arena floor, where a convict playing Orpheus would be torn apart by real bears. Where did this endless stream of performers come from? The numbers initially just seem large. Pompey the Great once brought 600 lions into the arena. Emperor Augustus arranged for the killing of 3,500 animals during his reign, but these were just rehearsals. During the 100-day games celebrating the opening of the Colosseum, over 9,000 wild beasts were killed. That is almost twice the entire global population of cheetahs living on the planet today. This entertainment industry led to the complete extinction of species in North Africa and the Middle East, including the Barbary lion. It was a demonstration of absolute power. Rome proved it could import nature itself just to destroy it for the amusement of the crowd. The roar of 50,000 throats, the smell of hot sand, sweat, and fresh blood, the deafening snarl of a leopard drowning out a person's final scream. Imagine yourself there, in the stands. What would you feel? Primal horror or thrilling fascination? Answer honestly. Write just one word in the comments: horror or fascination. Your reaction is the key to understanding the conclusion of our investigation. It erases the comfortable line between a civilized 21st century viewer and a participant in a bloody show. Rome brought the public destruction of the body to a state of engineering perfection. Crucifixion was the slow deconstruction of the flesh. The arena was its rapid and spectacular rupture. This was the apex of cruelty directed at the physical shell. But while Rome was honing the art of killing the body, on the other side of the world, an execution was being developed that went immeasurably further. Its goal was not simply to kill, but to methodically, with surgical precision, erase the very identity of a person from history and even from the afterlife. We have arrived at the pinnacle of the code of cruelty, a punishment that was more terrifying than death itself. How can you kill a person 1,000 times before they die? It defies logic itself. At first glance, the Chinese execution of lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts, seems like chaotic savagery, the public and slow infliction of numerous wounds over several hours. The goal, it would seem, is obvious: maximum pain. But the facts destroy this picture. The executioner was not a butcher, but a master of anatomy who knew how to cut without severing major arteries to avoid a quick death. The victim was often given opium, not to ease their suffering, but on the contrary, to keep them conscious for as long as possible. This was not arbitrary. It was a bureaucratized procedure. The number of cuts was strictly regulated by law. The process resembled the dismantling of an occupied building. The executioner did not demolish the walls, but carefully removed one brick at a time, ensuring the entire structure didn't collapse prematurely. Behind this surgical precision lay a purpose more terrifying than physical pain itself. An execution lasting up to 3 days seems like something from the Dark Ages, and indeed, lingqi was used in China since the Song dynasty, around the 10th century. This creates a false sense of historical distance, but the shocking truth lies in the dates. This execution was officially abolished only in 1905. There are real documentary photographs of the last public execution by lingqi, taken in the age of the telegraph, the first automobiles, and the dawn of cinema. It happened in the same year that Einstein published his theory of relativity. In these photos, crowds of spectators, including children, watch the procedure not with horror, but as if it were a routine event. This is not an ancient legend, but recent, documented history. But even seeing a real execution does not reveal its most terrible aspect. Why was such a complex procedure necessary? If the goal is pain and death, there are simpler ways. The answer lies in Chinese culture, where the integrity of the body after death was a guarantee of well-being in the afterlife. The body was the vessel for passage into the spirit world. At first glance, lingqi was simply the ultimate form of humiliation. But that is only the surface. Lingqi was a metaphysical execution. By destroying the body piece by piece, it symbolically and literally prevented the spirit from rejoining its ancestors. It condemned the soul to wander eternally as a hungry ghost. It was murder not only in this world, but also in the next, a punishment reserved for the gravest crimes, treason against the emperor or patricide. Lingqi erased a person from the fabric of society, from history, and from eternity itself. Here, cruelty ceases to be merely pain or spectacle. It becomes an instrument of total control over the body, the soul, and memory across generations. We have traveled from the aesthetics of sound in the brazen bull through the biological dehumanization of scaphism to the mass propaganda of the Roman arena. Lingqi incorporates all these elements and elevates them to a new, metaphysical level. Now that we have seen all the exhibits in this museum of inventive cruelty, we are ready to assemble all the pieces of the puzzle. We can answer the main question posed at the very beginning. Why did the most advanced civilizations invest their genius into the engineering of pain? In the final part, we will give the definitive answer to this question. The answer is simple and uncomfortable. Sophisticated cruelty was not a failure of civilization, but its key technology. It was not a bug, but a deliberate feature. We have seen the arsenal of power. The brazen bull was an instrument for turning pain into art. Scaphism was a technology of biological humiliation. Crucifixion was a giant billboard for state terror. The arena was a pressure release valve for mob aggression, and lingqi was a technology for controlling eternity itself. Cruelty was multifunctional. It was simultaneously law, entertainment, ritual, and propaganda. It was the language in which power spoke to its subjects and its enemies, the language of absolute domination. The ancient forms are gone. But do the principles remain? Cruelty has not disappeared. It has changed its mask. The public humiliation carried by crucifixion lives on today in cyberbullying and cancel culture. The transformation of suffering into a show, as in the Colosseum arena, is reflected in viral videos of violence. The technological sophistication of the brazen bull finds an echo in modern methods of psychological pressure and total surveillance. The instrument has changed. The smartphone has replaced the executioner's knife. But the goal remains the same: control and the demonstration of power. Cruelty is like a river that changes its course. The ancient channel of physical pain has run dry, but the river itself has carved new paths: digital humiliation and psychological pressure. We began this investigation with the story of the engineer Perillos, who was the first to test his own creation. But the circle has closed completely. Years later, the tyrant Phalaris was overthrown by a popular revolt. According to legend, he was executed in the very same brazen bull he so admired. The machine of pain consumed both its creator and its commissioner. This is not just an irony of fate, it is an eternal law. Cruelty, once unleashed upon the world, inevitably consumes the one who created it. The border between civilization and barbarism is not a wall, but a thin line, a line that each of us draws every single day. We have cracked the code of cruelty. We have seen its engineering genius, its political calculation, and its perverse aesthetics. Now, one last question remains, addressed to you. After all you have seen, what do you believe is the primary driver of such cruelty? Is it the dark nature of humanity itself, which enjoys the suffering of others? Or is it the cold calculation of power, for which fear is the most effective tool of control? No long arguments are needed. Just write one word in the comments: nature or power. Let's see what we should fear more, the monster within us or the system above us.